Late in the evening, the streets were quiet except for the hum of passing cars and the soft glow of streetlights stretching across the road. The night air carried a stillness that only small towns seemed to hold, where every corner looked familiar, yet the shadows sometimes made things feel uncertain. The army commander sat behind the wheel of his car, a polished black sedan that carried the weight of his years of service. He had just left his sister's home, where laughter and stories had filled the kitchen table. It had been one of those rare evenings where family felt whole, where duty could take a back seat, and simple joys could shine brighter than medals or ranks. He drove calmly, his hands steady on the wheel, his thoughts drifting to memories of his childhood. He remembered running down dirt roads barefoot, dreaming about one day wearing the uniform of a soldier. He had seen hard times growing up, but those times had made him stronger. Every scar, every battle, every sacrifice had shaped him into the man he was tonight. A man respected by his peers, admired by his juniors, and trusted by his nation. Yet at this moment, none of those titles mattered. He was just a man heading home after a warm family gathering, enjoying the quiet of the road. But not everyone who crossed paths with him saw him in the same way. A police car, parked on the shoulder of the road, had noticed the sleek sedan glide past. Inside, the officer leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. To him, the sight of a black man driving such a car at this hour didn't add up. He didn't pause to consider the countless possibilities, that the driver had earned it, that he was someone of importance, that he was simply living his life like anyone else. No, his first thought was suspicion, and suspicion turned quickly into judgment. He flicked on the red and blue lights, the siren silent but the glow unmistakable in the rearview mirror. The commander noticed the flashing lights behind him. He sighed softly, not out of guilt but out of familiarity. He had seen this scene play out many times before, sometimes with him, sometimes with friends or strangers. Being stopped on the road was not new. He pulled over calmly to the side, parked his car, and turned off the engine. His heart did not race, nor did his hands shake. He had faced moments far more dangerous than this. Yet something inside him told him to stay very still tonight, to tread carefully. Because not every battle is fought on a field. Some are fought in silence, in patience, in restraint. The officer stepped out of his cruiser, his boots heavy on the pavement. His flashlight beam cut through the night, landing sharply on the car's tinted window. He barked out instructions before even reaching the driver's side. "Roll down the window. Hands where I can see them." His voice carried the edge of authority, but also the sharpness of prejudice, an impatience that came from assumptions rather than facts. The commander did as instructed. He lowered the window slowly, resting both hands clearly on the steering wheel. His face was calm, his eyes steady. He knew any sudden move, no matter how innocent, could be twisted into a reason for aggression. "Good evening, officer," he said in a voice that was steady and respectful. Years of discipline had taught him the power of tone, the ability to diffuse tension even when none should exist. The officer squinted, shining the light into the car, scanning the interior as though expecting something illegal to appear out of thin air. "Where are you coming from?" he demanded. The commander answered honestly, "From my sister's house. Just heading home." His words were plain, but they carried a weight of patience. He didn't argue, didn't challenge, though part of him wanted to ask, "Why does it matter?" The officer didn't seem satisfied. His hand hovered near his holster, his suspicion thick in the air. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered harshly. The night grew quieter. Even the crickets seemed to hush, as though nature itself sensed the tension. The commander hesitated for just a moment, then nodded slowly. He opened the door carefully, moving in a way that was deliberate, every motion showing he was not a threat. His tall frame stepped out into the night air, the streetlight catching the sharp lines of his uniform jacket hanging neatly on the back seat. A jacket that told stories of wars, victories, and sacrifices. But the officer didn't see it. He didn't care to look. "Hands where I can see them," the officer barked again, this time more aggressively, pulling his gun halfway from the holster. The commander froze, his hands raised, palms open. He was no stranger to weapons. He had carried rifles heavier than this man's pistol, had commanded units that marched into the face of danger. But standing here on a quiet roadside, he was not a commander. He was a target of suspicion. And he knew the smallest slip, even a misunderstanding, could end everything. A car slowed as it passed by, the driver glancing out the window, sensing something was wrong. Not far away, a woman on her porch noticed the flashing lights and began recording on her phone, a habit many had developed in times like these. One by one, neighbors peeked out of windows, drawn by curiosity and worry. Their presence didn't change the officer's stance. His gun was now drawn fully, pointed squarely at the commander's chest. His voice shook, not with fear, but with a dangerous mix of pride and prejudice. "Don't move. Don't you dare move!" The commander's voice remained calm, almost unnervingly so. "Officer, I am not a threat. My hands are raised. I just want to go home." His tone carried not fear but dignity, a strength that came from years of service. Yet the officer's eyes narrowed, convinced he was hiding something, convinced that the man in front of him couldn't possibly be who he appeared to be. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. The night air grew heavier, every sound amplified. The hum of the streetlight, the faint bark of a dog, the shuffle of neighbors gathering at a distance. The commander's mind worked quietly, calculating every word, every move. He had faced enemies overseas, but here at home the battle was different. It wasn't about firepower, it was about perception. And perception could be just as deadly. The officer shouted again, "What's in the car?" "What are you hiding?" His flashlight beam darted across the leather seats, catching the glint of metals pinned neatly to a small case resting on the passenger side. The commander saw it too and knew that if the officer took 1 second to actually look, the truth would be right there. But the gun didn't lower. If anything, the grip grew tighter. The commander slowly drew in a breath. "I'm going to explain something," he said carefully, his voice steady. "I am an Army commander. I serve this country. My identification is in my wallet, in my jacket, inside the car. I will not move unless you give me permission." He spoke like he was trained to de-escalate, measured words designed to calm, even when the other man didn't want to listen. But the officer only scoffed. "Nice story. Do you expect me to believe that?" His finger twitched on the trigger, the weight of the weapon pointing at a man who had carried far greater responsibilities than this officer could imagine. The neighbors' whispers grew. Phones lifted higher, recording the unfolding drama. The commander's chest rose and fell with each breath, steady, patient, waiting for the moment when truth might finally break through the fog of suspicion. And so the night stood still. One man holding a gun out of prejudice, another holding his hands out of discipline, while the world watched silently, unaware that this encounter was about to change more than just the lives of two men. It was about to shake an entire community awake. The tension on the quiet street thickened like fog that refused to lift. Every second seemed to stretch longer than the last, and the world around the two men felt almost unreal, as if it had slowed down just for this moment. The officer's hand remained firm on the gun, his eyes scanning the commander as though trying to read a hidden motive in the calm face that stared back at him. The commander's stance was deliberate, careful, every muscle relaxed yet prepared, his mind racing even as his voice stayed soft and measured. He knew this moment could spiral into disaster if he made even the smallest mistake. "I told you," the commander said gently, his tone steady. "I am an Army commander. You don't need to do this. I will cooperate. You can check my ID. You can call my office. I have nothing to hide." The officer did not lower his gun. He scoffed, a harsh, bitter sound that seemed to echo down the empty street. "Army commander or not, you're still a man with dark skin driving a fancy car at night. That doesn't make me believe anything about you." "Hands up and don't move!" The commander's eyes didn't waver. He noticed the subtle tremor in the officer's grip, the slight hesitation in his stance. He knew that beneath the anger and arrogance lay fear that could explode if he misstepped. His mind flashed to all the reports he had read over the years, stories of men and women being harmed because someone assumed the worst. He had seen people judged unfairly countless times. But tonight he was living it himself, face to face. A man of service and discipline being treated as a threat simply because of the color of his skin. Nearby, the small crowd of neighbors and passers-by had begun to gather at a cautious distance. Phones were raised, recording every moment. Some whispered quietly to each other, their voices blending into the night. Others froze, unsure whether to intervene or stay safe. It was a moment that would soon be shared online, dissected by strangers across the world. But for now it was intensely personal. The commander could feel the weight of each person's gaze, their silent prayers for a peaceful outcome. "Sir?" The commander continued, keeping his voice calm and even. I understand your job is to keep people safe. I respect that. But I'm not your enemy. I'm not hiding anything. Please, let us handle this safely. I have identification right here. I will show it to you. The officer's eyes narrowed. Suspicion hardened into impatience. Show me your ID then. Step aside from the car slowly. No sudden movements. His finger remained close to the trigger. The commander obeyed, moving carefully, deliberately. Every step was measured, his hands in full view, his expression calm. He could feel the tension in the air like electricity. One wrong move, one false assumption, and the scene could spiral out of control in seconds. Yet he maintained his composure, knowing that fear and panic would only make the situation worse. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, pulling out his wallet and opened it to reveal his military ID. The officer's eyes flicked down, scanning the card, but his face remained unreadable. The commander spoke again, his tone steady. You can see it here.
I am not lying.
I serve my country. My rank, my name, it's all valid. You don't have to believe me, but the facts are here. The officer's hand trembled slightly as he took the card, examining it closely. There was a pause, a crack in the armor of his certainty. I didn't know. His voice trailed off, uncertain, almost as if he was struggling to reconcile his prejudice with the truth in front of him. The commander nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement not of triumph, but of the fragile moment of understanding that had begun to appear. It's okay, he said softly. Mistakes happen, but we have to handle them safely. No one should get hurt here, not you, not me, not anyone watching. The officer's shoulders sagged slightly, the tension in his body easing, if only a little. His eyes met the commander's, and for a fleeting second there was recognition. Not respect yet, but awareness. He had assumed the worst, acted on bias, and now faced the undeniable truth of his error. The crowd began to murmur, relief spreading slowly as it became clear that the immediate danger had passed. Phones continued to record, capturing not just the confrontation but also the calm, deliberate restraint of the commander. People whispered about the bravery it took to remain composed under such scrutiny, and about the recklessness of an officer who had allowed bias to cloud his judgment. The commander remained calm, his presence a beacon of reason. Officer, I understand the pressures of your job, he said, keeping his tone neutral. But bias has no place in judgment. We have a responsibility to each other, to our communities, to act fairly. Tonight we were lucky that this ended without harm. Let's learn from it. Let's make sure this doesn't happen again. The officer lowered his gun fully, his face flushed with shame and embarrassment. He muttered something under his breath, almost inaudible, before finally speaking louder. I overreacted. I should have asked first. I apologize. The commander nodded again, still composed. Acknowledging the mistake is the first step. Make sure it doesn't happen again. That is how we move forward. That is how trust is rebuilt. As the officer stepped back and began to regain his composure, the commander moved slowly toward his car. He replaced the ID in his wallet and carefully got back inside. The engine started, a low hum breaking the silence of the street, signaling that life could continue. Yet the events of the night had left a mark on everyone who witnessed them. Neighbors and bystanders continued to whisper, some shaking their heads, others discussing what they had just seen. It was a lesson in humanity, in restraint and courage under pressure. The commander knew that while he had escaped physical danger, the larger battle against prejudice, against assumptions, against unfair treatment was ongoing. This was a fight that could not be won in one night, but every moment like this contributed to awareness, to change. Driving slowly away, the commander reflected on the fragility of trust, on the importance of composure, and on the power of calm reasoning in the face of fear and ignorance. He thought about the countless soldiers he had trained, the lessons he had imparted, and the values he had carried into every situation. Courage was not just about facing bullets. It was about facing assumptions, facing hostility, and facing the danger that came from ignorance and prejudice. Meanwhile, the officer remained on the roadside, still shaken. He had faced someone calm, collected, and dignified under pressure, and it had revealed his own shortcomings in stark relief. His training, his authority, his badge, they were meaningless if he allowed bias to dictate his actions. He had been lucky tonight. Luck alone had prevented tragedy. He knew he had to change, not just for his own sake, but for the safety of every person he might encounter in the future. The quiet street slowly returned to normal, the flashing lights fading as the officer returned to his cruiser. The commander's car disappeared into the night, headlights cutting through the darkness, leaving behind a small, silent crowd that would not soon forget what they had witnessed. In the weeks and months that followed, the incident became more than a story of confrontation. It became a lesson in restraint, in fairness, and in the consequences of unchecked prejudice. The officer faced internal investigations, retraining, and the scrutiny of a community unwilling to accept bias in uniform. The commander continued his duties with the same dignity, his example inspiring not just those in the military, but ordinary citizens who learned of his calm courage and moral strength. What had begun as a tense roadside confrontation ended as a powerful reminder. Humanity, patience, and composure can prevail over fear, anger, and prejudice. And in that quiet moment on the street, when the officer's gun had pointed at the wrong man, the lesson was clear. Respect, recognition, and understanding must come first, before assumptions, before actions, and before judgment. The night still hung heavy over the quiet streets, but the tension had shifted in subtle ways. The initial confrontation on the roadside had left an invisible mark on everyone present. The officer's hands still trembled slightly as he held the identification the commander had calmly handed over. Even as he studied the ID, disbelief lingered in his eyes, fighting against the undeniable truth printed on the card. There it was in plain sight. The man he had aimed his weapon at, assuming danger and criminality, was not just an ordinary citizen. He was a decorated army commander, someone who had dedicated his life to service, discipline, and protecting others. The revelation struck the officer like a sudden blow. He had allowed assumptions, prejudice, and a narrow view of the world to govern his actions. For a moment, the weight of his mistake settled over him like a physical force, pressing on his chest and making every breath feel heavy. He looked up at the commander, who stood calmly, his hand still raised just slightly, showing no anger, only patience. It was a presence that demanded acknowledgement, not confrontation. The commander spoke quietly, deliberately, his voice carrying calm authority that only years of experience could command. "Officer, I know this must be shocking. You acted out of concern, out of fear, but also out of assumptions that were wrong. I am not your enemy. I have never been your enemy. Let this moment teach you something, and teach everyone here watching that judgment without understanding can be dangerous." The officer lowered his gun slowly, as if releasing a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. His eyes dropped to the ground, shame washing over him. I didn't realize," he muttered, almost unable to finish the thought. I shouldn't have drawn my weapon. I acted too fast." The commander nodded once, acknowledging the words without a hint of malice. Recognition of the mistake is important, but it is what you do after that that matters. How you respond, how you learn, how you change. These are what define your character, your integrity, and your ability to serve your community safely. Around them, the small crowd that had gathered continued to whisper. Some were holding their phones, capturing every detail of the confrontation. Others simply stood still, unsure whether to speak or move. The tension that had gripped the street moments ago had begun to shift, replaced by a mixture of awe, relief, and anger. People were angry, not at the commander, but at the way an individual's assumptions and biases had nearly turned a simple traffic stop into a disaster. They were in awe of the commander's composure, the way he had maintained dignity under pressure, and relief that the situation had ended without physical harm. The commander remained calm, his posture steady, his eyes scanning the street as though seeing beyond the moment. "It is easy," he said quietly, "to act on fear, on assumptions, on what we think we see. But courage is not just physical. Courage is moral. Courage is the restraint to pause, to listen, to seek the truth before making a decision that can cost someone their life." The officer's shoulders sagged as he absorbed the words. He had been taught protocol, training, procedures, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Nothing had drilled into him the consequences of letting bias guide his actions. His mind replayed every instant. The flash of the headlights, the calm demeanor of the commander, the way he had kept his hands visible, his voice measured and steady. For all the arrogance and certainty he had carried before, it evaporated now in the face of undeniable truth. The commander took a careful step toward the car, keeping every motion deliberate. He knew the officer might still be on edge, still sensitive to sudden movements. He bent slightly, opening the passenger side door with care to retrieve his identification and military papers that were resting on the seat. The officer watched, tense, unsure, but he didn't move to intervene. The crowd murmured quietly, sensing the delicate balance of the moment. "Officer," the commander said, holding the documents clearly in his hands, "everything here proves who I am and what I have done. I served in conflict zones, led units into dangerous situations, made decisions that affected hundreds of lives. But none of that matters here. What matters is that no one was hurt tonight. That is the only thing that matters in this moment." The officer took a shaky breath, finally lowering the weapon entirely. His grip on the gun loosened and he took a step back as if physically trying to distance himself from his mistake. I don't know what to say," he admitted, voice almost breaking. I should have checked. I should have listened. I made a terrible mistake." "You have acknowledged it," the commander said gently. "Now ensure it never happens again. Learn from this. That is the responsibility you have, not just to yourself, but to everyone who trusts law enforcement to act fairly and without prejudice." A soft wind blew down the street, rustling leaves and bringing a sense of movement to the heavy night. The commander's calm presence contrasted sharply with the officer's nervous energy, and it seemed to make the tension dissipate slowly, like fog retreating under the first morning light. The crowd sensed the shift, and some began to clap quietly, almost instinctively, in recognition of the restraint and moral courage they had just witnessed. Then came the moment of wider realization. One of the neighbors who had been recording on their phone whispered loudly, "He's really an army commander? That's amazing." Others gathered closer, peering at the documents briefly shown, the metallic gleam of medals and insignia catching the faint light. Murmurs of astonishment spread like wildfire. "He's that high-ranking? Wow." He stayed so calm. "Can you imagine?" The officer looked around and saw the reactions. For the first time, he understood the weight of the situation, not just his personal embarrassment, but the lesson being witnessed by the community. He had almost let bias dictate action, almost let his assumptions turn into tragedy, and now the consequences of his behavior were plain for all to see. The commander spoke again, addressing both the officer and the small group gathered. "Moments like this are teaching moments. They remind us of the power of restraint, of awareness, of seeing beyond assumptions. Courage does not always mean confrontation. Sometimes it means patience, composure, and moral clarity in the face of fear." The officer nodded, swallowing hard. His face was pale, his pride bruised, but there was a glimmer of understanding forming. I understand. I have to do better," he said, finally acknowledging the truth of the commander's words. The commander nodded, satisfied that the immediate danger had passed, but aware that the real work, the education, the self-reflection, the accountability was just beginning. He moved back to his car, carefully placing his documents inside. The hum of the engine as he started it broke the stillness, a gentle signal that life would continue, though changed forever by this night. As the commander drove away slowly, the officer remained on the roadside, staring at the retreating taillights. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, shame, regret, realization, and the dawning understanding of how assumptions can endanger lives. He knew the department would hold him accountable, and he accepted that. But more importantly, he knew he would have to confront the prejudices within himself, the biases that had allowed fear to cloud judgment. The small crowd dispersed slowly, but the impact lingered. People spoke quietly about the courage it took to remain calm, about the dangers of acting on assumptions, and about the reminder that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of appearances or preconceived notions. The commander's behavior had shown a standard of human decency, a lesson in leadership that transcended titles and ranks. Over the following days, the story began to spread. Social media captured the videos and news outlets picked up the incident, emphasizing the restraint, composure, and moral courage displayed by the commander. Discussions began about the importance of addressing prejudice within law enforcement, the value of training, and the human responsibility to act fairly, even when fear and assumptions tempt otherwise. The commander continued his duties unaffected by the publicity, maintaining the same integrity and calm that had defined him throughout his career. Meanwhile, The officer faced the consequences of his actions. Internal reviews were conducted, disciplinary measures initiated, and retraining mandated. He reflected constantly, replaying the encounter, understanding the gravity of his mistake, and committing to change. The lesson had been harsh, but it was now part of him, a reminder that every individual, regardless of authority, must be aware of their assumptions and their power. The commander's words from that night remained powerful. Courage is not only physical but moral. Patience is as vital as action, and understanding is stronger than judgment. It was a moment that, though terrifying, became a story of human strength, wisdom, and resilience. Even weeks later, when the incident was discussed in community meetings and military forums, the details remained the same. A tense night, a drawn gun, and the shocking revelation of truth. But what people remembered most was not the fear or the danger. It was the calmness, the dignity, and the humanity displayed by a man who could have reacted in anger, but chose understanding instead. The officer, sitting quietly in his own thoughts, realized he had witnessed a lesson that could change his approach to his job, his life, and the way he saw people. He understood that recognition of mistakes, accountability, and the days after the roadside confrontation were filled with a quiet tension that spread through the neighborhood, the city, and even further than the small circle of people who had witnessed it firsthand. Word traveled quickly. Someone had uploaded a video captured on a phone, and within hours it had made its way to social media. The footage showed the confrontation exactly as it had unfolded. The officer pointing his gun, the commander standing calmly with his hands raised, and the subtle moment when his military identification proved who he truly was. The video carried a weight that words alone could not, and soon, countless people across the region had seen the scene unfold. On the local news, anchors discussed the incident with a mixture of shock and concern. They replayed the footage, pausing on moments where the tension had been most intense. Interviews were conducted with neighbors who had witnessed the event. One elderly woman, still shaking slightly, said, "I've never seen anything like that. I was so afraid someone would get hurt. But the way he stayed calm, it was something else." Children who had peeked through their windows were asked what they remembered. Many simply described the commander as brave and calm, though their voices carried the innocence of youth that had yet to understand the danger of prejudice in the world. The commander, meanwhile, went about his normal routine. He continued to serve his country, attended meetings, and completed duties that required focus and precision. Yet behind his calm demeanor, he reflected on the events of that night. He thought not about fear or anger, but about the lesson it had created, the lesson that could ripple far beyond the few minutes of confrontation. Prejudice and assumptions were not abstract concepts. They were tangible dangers that could threaten lives if left unchecked. The more he considered it, the more he realized that the impact of this moment was not just personal. It was societal. The police department faced immediate scrutiny. Internal Affairs opened a full investigation into the officer's actions. Colleagues and superiors reviewed the circumstances. Statements were taken and procedural questions were asked. How had the situation escalated so quickly? How had bias influenced the officer's judgment? What safeguards could prevent similar events in the future? Every answer pointed to the same uncomfortable truth. Assumptions and prejudice had nearly caused an irreversible tragedy. The officer, once confident and assured in his authority, now faced the weight of accountability. He was suspended from duty pending the investigation, and counselors were assigned to help him reflect on the events. He spent hours reviewing the video footage himself, watching each motion, each word, each decision. His stomach tightened with guilt every time he saw the commander standing calmly, unshaken by fear or anger. The realization that his actions could have cost someone their life hit him harder than any punishment could. He had to confront not only his behavior, but the biases that had shaped it, biases he had never questioned until now. Communities, both local and national, began discussing the incident in forums, on talk shows, and in public meetings. People debated how an officer's assumptions could nearly result in tragedy, and they explored the broader issues of trust, authority, and racial bias. The commander's calm demeanor became a central theme of these discussions. Many praised him for his ability to remain composed under pressure, to de-escalate the situation without anger, and to communicate clearly and effectively. His actions had shown that courage and leadership were not measured by aggression. but by the ability to maintain dignity and clarity in the face of hostility. The commander received countless messages of support from ordinary citizens and fellow soldiers alike. Some wrote to say they had been inspired by his restraint, hoping to emulate his composure in their own lives. Others expressed anger at the officer's behavior and the systems that allowed prejudice to influence decisions. Amid all the praise and criticism, the commander remained humble. He did not seek recognition. He wanted the moment to be a reminder to everyone that the true measure of strength is in understanding, patience, and moral clarity, not in power or force. Within the police department, discussions about training and accountability intensified. Workshops were scheduled, emphasizing the importance of recognizing bias and the consequences of acting on assumptions. Officers were asked to consider their actions, their judgments, and the responsibility that came with their authority. The incident became a case study, not as a way to shame, but as a way to educate. It was a reminder that one misjudgment could endanger lives and that vigilance, self-awareness, and restraint were as important as courage in uniform. The officer himself attended these sessions, sometimes silently reflecting, sometimes participating in conversations about accountability and personal growth. Each session was a painful reminder of how quickly assumptions could cloud judgment and how vital it was to pause, to question, and to seek the truth. He learned that courage was not just about enforcing laws. It was about ensuring that enforcement was fair, unbiased, and rooted in humanity. The officer began to write notes, creating a personal pledge to hold himself accountable, to recognize bias when it emerged, and to act with thoughtfulness in all interactions. Meanwhile, the commander continued to receive recognition from the military for his professional service, though he personally focused less on accolades and more on the lessons that could be drawn from the incident. In his conversations with colleagues, he stressed the importance of patience, observation, and the ability to read a situation without judgment. Authority is powerful, he would say quietly, but without understanding and restraint, it can be dangerous. The greatest victories are not always in battle. They are in the decisions we make in everyday life, in how we treat others, and in how we choose to respond to fear with courage, not force. Community leaders also took notice. Town hall meetings included discussions about law enforcement accountability, the importance of training, and fostering mutual respect between citizens and those in authority. The commander's story became a reference point for how situations could be handled safely and respectfully. It was used as an example for young cadets, new recruits, and even experienced officers, highlighting the need for empathy, patience, and clarity of judgment. The video of the incident continued to circulate online, sparking conversations and debates about fairness, authority, and racial bias. People discussed how assumptions could endanger lives and how crucial it was to confront prejudice when it appeared. The commander's calmness under pressure became a source of inspiration, while the officer's mistake became a lesson in accountability and self-reflection. Across the country, educators, leaders, and everyday citizens referenced the event as an example of both danger and hope. The danger of unchecked assumptions, and the hope that courage, patience, and humanity could prevail. For the officer, every interaction after that night was a reminder of the consequences of his actions. He approached his duties with renewed caution, awareness, and humility. Every stop, every decision, every judgment carried the lessons of that night. He recognized that authority was not a privilege to be wielded carelessly, but a responsibility that required constant reflection, understanding, and respect for the humanity of others. The commander, while continuing his own work, made sure to stay in touch with the community. He spoke at schools, community centers, and military forums, sharing his experience not as a story of fear, but as a lesson in composure, fairness, and moral courage. He emphasized that every individual had a role in shaping a safer, fairer society, not through power or aggression, but through understanding, empathy, and conscious decisions. In the weeks that followed, the officer met with his supervisors and counselors repeatedly. He examined every choice he had made, every assumption that had guided his actions, and every moment where he could have intervened differently. The process was painful, humbling, and transformative. Slowly, he began to internalize the idea that authority alone was not enough. Awareness, restraint, and understanding were equally essential. The memory of that calm, composed figure standing in the street, hands raised, calm voice guiding the situation to safety, remained with him as a guide and a warning. At the same time, the community continued to heal and reflect. Conversations that had once been hushed began to emerge openly. People shared stories of bias, assumptions, and moments of misunderstanding, using the commander's experience as a springboard to discuss how to prevent similar incidents. The event, though frightening in the moment, became a catalyst for awareness, education, and progress. Months passed, but the lessons endured. The commander's calm and dignified response became a touchstone for discussions about courage, restraint, and humanity. The officer, now more reflective, approached every interaction with heightened awareness, striving to act with fairness and empathy. And the community, watching and learning, began to understand the power of patience, observation, and moral clarity in shaping safer and more just interactions. The roadside encounter, once a moment of near tragedy, had transformed into a powerful story of reflection, accountability, and change. What could have ended in violence had instead become a lesson, a conversation, and a guidepost for others. The commander's dignity and calm had not only preserved his own safety but had inspired. The morning after the confrontation, the world seemed both familiar and changed. The streets carried the usual rhythm of daily life, cars moving along with the hum of engines and the chatter of people beginning their day. Yet beneath the ordinary sounds, a quiet awareness lingered. Something had shifted. The story of the roadside encounter had spread further than anyone could have predicted. The commander, calm and composed in the face of danger, had left a mark not only on the officer involved, but on the wider community. People were thinking more carefully about how they approached others, how they judged, and how they acted when fear or suspicion arose. The commander himself moved with the same measured composure as always. He had returned home late that night, and though he had slept, his mind replayed the events, not with anger but with reflection. He thought about how quickly assumptions could escalate, how fragile trust could be, and how important it was for every individual, regardless of rank or role, to act with awareness and humanity. The incident had been unnerving, but it had also been instructive. It was a reminder that courage and wisdom were intertwined, and that leadership often revealed itself in moments where restraint was tested. At the local police department, the officer faced the consequences of his actions. Internal affairs had completed their initial review, and the officer was asked to meet with supervisors and counselors to discuss what had happened. The sessions were intense, uncomfortable, and unflinching. He watched the video over and over, each time feeling the weight of his mistake more profoundly. He had pointed a gun at a man who posed no threat, a man who had only sought to remain calm and cooperative. The realization stung deeply, and for the first time in his career, he felt the full gravity of the responsibility that came with wearing a uniform. During these sessions, the officer spoke openly about his assumptions, his fear, and his rushed judgment. He admitted that prejudice had influenced his perception, even if subconsciously. He reflected on the brief moments when doubt had entered his mind but had been dismissed. He considered the calmness of the commander, the patience in his tone, and the restraint in his movements. Each of these aspects highlighted the contrast between judgment and understanding, reaction and reflection, fear and courage. By the end of the sessions, the officer committed to change. He pledged to undergo additional training, to confront biases within himself, and to approach every situation with greater awareness and care. Meanwhile, the community continued to process the events. Schools, community centers, and local organizations hosted discussions about the encounter, using it as a case study for teaching awareness, empathy, and responsible behavior. Teachers spoke to students about the dangers of assumptions, while parents shared the video and its lessons at home. The commander's calm response became a symbol of dignity, composure, and moral courage. People marveled at how someone could face a weapon with neither panic nor anger, instead showing clarity of thought and restraint. The commander himself took part in many of these discussions. He spoke to young cadets, emphasizing that true strength was not only physical but also moral. Leadership is not just about giving orders or enforcing rules, he said. It is about understanding, patience, and the courage to do what is right, even when fear or anger tempts you to act otherwise. Every encounter, every decision has consequences. Recognize that. Respect that. Act with humanity. At home, the commander reflected on the incident from a personal perspective. He thought about the officer, about the community, and about the countless individuals who might face judgment based on assumptions in their daily lives. He recognized that while the confrontation had ended safely, it could have been very different. This understanding reinforced his commitment to serving as an example, not through accolades or recognition, but through consistent, measured actions. His approach to life had always been grounded in discipline, fairness, and respect, but now he saw the broader ripple effect of these values. The officer, too, carried the lesson into his daily routine. Each interaction with the public became a reminder of the responsibility he bore. He approached people more thoughtfully, asked questions before assuming, and consciously monitored his reactions. Slowly, others began to notice the change. Colleagues observed his greater awareness, and citizens recognized his improved patience and fairness. The officer understood that the memory of that night, of the man standing calmly despite the drawn weapon, would guide him for the rest of his life. It had been a hard lesson, but an essential one. As weeks turned into months, the story gained wider attention. Social media posts were shared repeatedly, and news outlets revisited the incident with commentary on leadership, bias, and moral courage. People debated, reflected, and learned. The commander remained humble, refusing personal credit for the attention. He understood that the real value of the moment was not fame, but the lesson it carried. The ability to act with dignity, the courage to remain calm under pressure, and the wisdom to recognize the humanity in others. Community leaders also took concrete steps in response to the incident. They encouraged workshops on bias awareness, communication, and de-escalation for both law enforcement and the public. The encounter became a model for teaching restraint, responsibility, and empathy. People began to discuss how to prevent similar events, sharing ideas on training protocols and the importance of patience and observation in tense situations. The commander's example became a reference point, not only for moral courage but also for practical strategies to reduce conflict and increase understanding. The officer's journey continued. He wrote personal reflections, documenting his thoughts, his guilt, and the steps he was taking to improve. He practiced awareness exercises, participated in workshops, and sought feedback from mentors. Each day he reminded himself of the man he had almost harmed and of the calm dignity that had guided the situation to safety. The memory of the commander's composure became a touchstone for his actions, guiding him toward better decisions and greater empathy. The commander's influence extended beyond the local community. Military forums and training sessions referenced the incident as an example of leadership under pressure. His response highlighted the importance of moral courage, ethical decision-making, and the power of restraint. Soldiers and cadets studied the confrontation, learning how patience and clear thinking could prevent disaster, even when facing unexpected or dangerous situations. The lesson was clear. Courage was not measured by aggression or force, but by the ability to maintain composure, assess situations rationally, and act with fairness and humanity. Back in the neighborhood, the small group of bystanders who had first witnessed the confrontation shared their experiences repeatedly. They spoke of fear, relief, and admiration. They described the moment when tension hung thick in the air, and then how it was broken not by confrontation but by calm dialogue, understanding, and moral clarity. Their stories reinforced the idea that ordinary people could witness extraordinary courage, and that reflection, patience, and moral judgment could inspire entire communities. The commander also used the experience to mentor young people. He spoke about the dangers of judging others based on appearance, assumptions, or fear. He explained how discipline and patience were not only tools for military success, but for life itself. In every interaction, he told them, you have a choice. You can react with fear, with anger, with prejudice, or you can act with thought, understanding, and empathy. Those choices define who you are and how you impact the world. Even the officer began to share his experience in controlled settings, acknowledging his mistakes and explaining the lessons he had learned. His honesty and willingness to confront his own biases encouraged dialogue, understanding, and a commitment to improvement. People appreciated his transparency, recognizing that acknowledging mistakes was a vital step toward accountability, growth, and better service. Months later, when the story was recounted in news articles, training seminars, and community discussions, the focus was not on blame or shame but on lessons learned and changes made. It had become a story of education, transformation, and hope. The commander's patience and calmness were praised, the officer's reflection and growth were noted, and the community's increased awareness was celebrated. The incident that had begun as a moment of tension had become a powerful catalyst for understanding, empathy, and moral clarity. The commander himself continued his life quietly, but with renewed purpose. He knew that every encounter, whether in uniform or out, carried the potential to teach or harm. He approached each day with awareness, calm, and discipline. He recognized that true leadership was not in asserting authority or winning battles, but in guiding others through example and showing patience, restraint, and moral courage. The officer, now more conscientious, carried the lessons with him into every action. His decisions were slower, more deliberate, more conscious of the humanity of those he interacted with. He had learned the hard way that assumptions could be dangerous, that fear could mislead, and that authority without reflection could harm those it was meant to protect. Every time he remembered the commander's calm presence, he reminded himself of the responsibility to act with fairness, patience, and understanding. In the end, the confront,